A black boy defends a Hell's Angel from cops, and hours later, the entire city can't believe what happens next. It starts on an ordinary afternoon, until one terrified teenager steps between angry officers and a bleeding biker. He doesn't think, he just acts. Cameras roll, the world watches. In minutes, he's a hero. But by nightfall, the same video turns him into a villain. His school suspends him. The police want him charged, and the only man who stands by him is the rough, broken biker he just saved. What happens when a boy raised on faith joins forces with a man who's lost all of it? When kindness collides with hate and the truth becomes a weapon? One act of courage sparked a storm that no one saw coming. But in a world ready to tear them apart, can two strangers from opposite sides of life save each other before it's too late? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Detroit's weathered streets as Trey Jackson pedaled his bike homeward. The rhythm of his wheels matched the gospel tune he hummed, Amazing Grace, his mama's favorite. Sweat trickled down his neck in the thick summer air, his grocery store uniform still carrying the chill of the produce section, where he'd spent his shift stocking shelves. At 16, Trey's dreams were already crystal clear. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see himself in paramedic blues, rushing to help people in their darkest moments. The image burned bright in his mind, right alongside the memory of waiting with his mama for an ambulance that came too late for his father. Some wounds time couldn't heal completely, but they could shape a person's purpose. The corner quick stop came into view, its faded signs and rusty gas pumps familiar landmarks on his route home. But today, something was different. Raised voices cut through the usual street noise, sharp and angry. Two police officers stood at pump number 3, their stance aggressive as they confronted an older white man in a leather vest. Even from a distance, Trey could see the Hell's Angels patch on the back, faded but unmistakable. The man's weathered face was lined with years of hard living, his gray beard unkempt, but there was something in his blue eyes that spoke of weariness rather than threat. "Against the pump now," one officer barked, his hand already on his belt. "I ain't done nothing wrong," the biker protested, his voice gravelly but steady. "Just trying to get some gas." Officer Kearns, Trey could read his nameplate from where he'd stopped, suddenly shoved the older man hard against the metal pump. The biker's head snapped back, and something in Trey's chest tightened. He thought of his father, thought of waiting, helpless. Before he could think better of it, Trey dropped his bike and ran toward them. "Hey, stop!" His voice cracked with emotion. "He's not fighting you!" The second officer turned, surprise flickering across his face at the sight of a black teenager running toward them. But Trey was focused on Officer Kearns, whose arm was pressed against the biker's throat. Without thinking, Trey grabbed Kearns's arm, trying to pull it away. "He can't breathe," Trey pleaded, his heart hammering against his ribs. Time seemed to slow. He was suddenly aware of a small crowd gathering, of phones raised to record. The second officer grabbed him, pulling him back roughly. Trey's feet stumbled on the concrete. "On your knees," the second officer commanded. But before he could comply, an older woman pushed through the onlookers. "I saw the whole thing," she called out, her voice sharp and clear. "That boy was trying to stop excessive force, nothing more. I've got it all on video." The officers exchanged glances. The biker, Ray Bulldog Myers, Trey would later learn, was catching his breath, one hand pressed against his throat. Officer Kearns's face had turned an ugly shade of red. "Let him go," Kearns finally growled. "But you better get out of here, kid, now." Trey's legs felt like water as he backed away. He could feel eyes on him from every direction, some concerned, some curious, all recording. The biker caught his gaze for a moment, something unreadable passing between them. Retrieving his bike with trembling hands, Trey pedaled home faster than he ever had before. The humid air felt thick in his lungs, and his mama's warnings about keeping his head down echoed in his ears. But he couldn't have stood by. He just couldn't. In their small but tidy living room, Danielle Jackson sat on the edge of their worn couch, her phone clutched in her hand. The video was already spreading across social media like wildfire, her son, her baby boy, confronting armed officers to protect a stranger. Her heart swelled with pride even as fear knotted her stomach. The footage showed what the officers wouldn't admit: Trey acting to protect someone in need, just like she'd raised him to do. But she knew too well how quickly such moments could be twisted, how dangerous it was for a young black man to draw attention to himself, even for doing right. "Lord, protect my boy," she whispered, her free hand pressed against her heart as she watched the video for the 10th time. The comments were already flooding in, some calling Trey a hero, others twisting the narrative to paint him as an aggressor. Danielle could feel the weight of what was coming settling onto her shoulders. When she heard Trey's key in the lock, she stood, smoothing her nurse's scrubs with trembling hands. He stepped inside, still breathing hard from his ride, and their eyes met. "Mama," he started, his voice small. "I had to—" She crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled him into her arms, feeling his heart racing against her chest. "I know, baby," she whispered into his hair. "I know you did." They stood there in the growing evening shadows, mother and son, as their phones buzzed with notifications, and the world outside their door began to spin their story in 1,000 different directions. But in that moment, they held on to what mattered: each other, and the truth of what had happened at that gas station on a humid Detroit afternoon. Danielle pulled back just enough to look into her son's face, the face that looked so much like his father's. "We're going to pray," she said firmly, "and then we're going to figure out what comes next. Together." Trey nodded, his shoulders straightening slightly. The same courage that had driven him to act at the gas station showed in his eyes now. Whatever came next, he knew in his heart he'd done the right thing. His mom had taught him that standing up for others was never wrong, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. Outside, the summer evening settled over Detroit like a heavy blanket, while inside their modest home, mother and son held on to their faith and each other, preparing for whatever tomorrow might bring. The video continued to spread, carrying their lives into a spotlight they never sought, but one that would test their strength, their faith, and their capacity for forgiveness in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The morning sun crept through Trey's window, casting warm stripes across his bed. His phone buzzed non-stop, lighting up with notifications. Bleary-eyed, he reached for it, expecting maybe a few messages from friends. Instead, his screen was flooded with thousands of alerts. "Did you see how many views?" His mother's voice came from the doorway. Danielle stood there in her morning robe, her own phone clutched tight. "Over 2 million, baby, and climbing." Trey sat up, his head spinning. Messages poured in from everywhere: social media, texts, news outlets. "Hero teenager stands up to police brutality," read one headline. Another called him Detroit's guardian angel. "Look outside," Danielle said softly. Trey pushed aside his curtain. News vans lined their modest street, cameras and reporters already setting up for morning broadcasts. "Mama, what do we do?" She sat on the edge of his bed, her face a mix of pride and worry. "We keep our heads straight. Remember what I always tell you about attention?" "Fame's like fire," Trey recited. "It can warm you or burn you." "That's right. Now get ready for school. And Trey?" She squeezed his hand. Be careful." At Detroit Central High, Trey tried to slip in quietly, but word had spread fast. Students crowded the hallways, phones raised high to catch a glimpse of him. Some clapped, others called out his name. Even teachers he'd never spoken to before smiled and nodded as he passed. "Man, you're like famous," his best friend Marcus exclaimed, falling into step beside him. "Did you see yourself on the morning news?" Trey shook his head, overwhelmed by the attention. In his first period class, Mrs. Rodriguez beamed at him with tears in her eyes. "What you did took real courage," she whispered as he passed her desk. Meanwhile, across town at Detroit General Hospital, Ray Bulldog Myers was waking up in a sterile white room. His throat ached where the officer's arm had pressed against it, and his ribs screamed with every breath. Bitterness filled his mouth like bile. A young nurse checked his vitals, her movements gentle but professional. "There's something you should see," she said, holding up her phone. "About yesterday." Ray watched the video through clouded eyes. He saw himself being pushed, the officer's face twisted with anger. Then came the shout, a young voice cutting through the chaos, a black teenager, barely more than a boy, stepping in to help a stranger. To help him. "That boy," Ray's voice was rough with emotion. He didn't see a criminal. He saw a man. The nurse nodded, dabbing at her own eyes. Later that afternoon, Ray made a call to Channel 7 News. His hands shook as he held the phone, but his voice stayed steady. The station aired his message within the hour. "I want to thank that young man," Ray said, his weathered face filling screens across Detroit. "What he did, he saved my life. Not just from those cops, but..." His voice trembled. "He showed me there's still good in this world, still people willing to help a stranger no matter what they look like." The footage went viral instantly, a tattooed ex-Hell's Angel choking up with gratitude. It touched something deep in people's hearts, this unlikely connection between a black teenager and an aging white biker. That evening, Trey stood outside Ray's hospital room, his mother's words echoing in his head. But something stronger than caution pulled him forward. He knocked softly. "Come in," called a gravelly voice. Ray sat propped up in bed, looking smaller somehow without his leather jacket. His arms were covered in faded tattoos, and a lifetime of hard living showed in every line of his face. But his eyes were clear and direct as they met Trey's. "Sir," Trey started, suddenly unsure what to say. "Ray," the older man corrected. "Just Ray." They looked at each other for a long moment, these two souls connected by one moment of courage. Finally, Ray held out his hand. Trey stepped forward and took it. The handshake was awkward but honest, a young, smooth hand clasping one rough with years. "You didn't have to do what you did," Ray said quietly. "Most people, they would have just kept walking. Filmed it maybe, but not step in. Not for someone like me." "It wasn't right, what they were doing," Trey replied simply. Ray's grip tightened slightly. "You did what no one ever did for me, kid." His voice was gruff with emotion. "No one ever stood up for me before. Not once in 62 years. The next 48 hours felt like a dream to Trey. His small front yard became a parking lot for gleaming motorcycles, their chrome catching the autumn sun. Leather-clad bikers, some with gray beards down to their chests, brought casseroles, pies, and enough food to fill their modest kitchen twice over. "Never seen anything like it," Danielle murmured, watching from behind the curtain as another group arrived. The bikers' rough appearance contrasted with their gentle manners as they delivered homemade dishes and small gifts for Trey. "My old lady made this lasagna special," one burly man said, his voice surprisingly soft. "It's her grandmother's recipe." On Wednesday morning, the rumble of motorcycles drew every eye on the block. A group of Hell's Angels, patches proud on their leather vests, had come to escort Trey to school. Their bikes formed a protective circle around him as he rode his bicycle, making him feel like some kind of young prince with an honor guard. "Nobody messes with family," said one of Ray's brothers, giving Trey a solemn nod before they roared away from the school entrance. Local news crews captured it all. The headlines read, "Unlikely Brotherhood and Breaking Barriers in Detroit." For those brief days, it seemed like something beautiful was blooming from the chaos, proof that courage could bridge any divide. But by Wednesday afternoon, the tide began to turn. Trey first noticed it when his phone started buzzing with angry messages. Someone had re-edited the gas station video, slowing down the moment he pulled the officer's arm, adding ominous music and red circles highlighting his hands. The new caption read, "Black teen attacks cop. The truth they don't want you to see." "This is a clear assault on a police officer performing his duties," the police union spokesperson declared on the evening news. "We condemn this dangerous interference with law enforcement and demand appropriate action." The school principal called Trey's mother Thursday morning. "We need to temporarily suspend Trey pending an investigation," he explained, his voice strained. "It's just procedure, Mrs. Jackson, for everyone's safety." Danielle's hands shook as she hung up the phone. "Stay inside today," she told Trey. "Please." Outside their house, the supportive crowds had been replaced by aggressive reporters. They shouted questions through the windows and stuck microphones in Danielle's face whenever she stepped outside. "How do you respond to allegations your son assaulted an officer? Did you raise him to disrespect law enforcement? Are you affiliated with any anti-police organizations?" Across town, Ray wasn't faring much better. 2 detectives visited his hospital room, their questions dripping with suspicion. "Quite a coincidence, you being at that gas station," one detective said, flipping through a thick file. "Especially given your history with certain organizations." "That was 30 years ago," Ray growled. "Criminal associations tend to linger," the other detective remarked. "Maybe this whole incident was staged? A way to stir up trouble?" The accusations made Ray's blood boil, but he thought of Trey, that brave kid who'd risked everything to help him. He couldn't let his temper make things worse. That evening, Ray checked himself out of the hospital against medical advice. His ribs protested every step, but he had to make things right. He caught a ride to the Jacksons' house, leaning heavily on a cane as he approached their door. When Danielle saw him through the peephole, her first instinct was to pretend no one was home. This man, however innocent in this particular situation, represented everything that was now threatening her son's future. But something in her heart, maybe the same instinct for compassion that Trey had inherited, made her pause. Still, when she opened the door, her words were ice. "Haven't you caused enough trouble?" Ray stood there, shoulders slumped, looking older than his 62 years. "Ma'am, I came to apologize. Your boy, he did a good thing, and now he's suffering for it. That ain't right." Danielle's hand tightened on the doorknob, ready to slam it shut. But then she saw the genuine pain in his eyes, the way he could barely stand straight from his injuries, and that ember of compassion flickered again. "Come in," she said finally, stepping aside. "We were just about to have dinner." Trey looked up from setting the table, surprised to see Ray limping into their small dining room. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, as Danielle brought out a modest meal of chicken and rice. "I had a son," Ray said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "About your age, Trey. Name was Michael." His weathered hands twisted in his lap. "Lost him to heroin 3 years ago. Nobody helped him either. Just another junkie's kid, they figured." Danielle's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "When your boy stepped in at that gas station," Ray continued, "it was like seeing everything Michael never got. Someone caring enough to help. Someone brave enough to do what's right. He looked at Trey with unexpected tenderness. I don't want what you did to bring you harm, son. I'm gonna make this right somehow. Danielle saw the tears gathering in the old biker's eyes. Without thinking, she reached for his hand. Let's pray, she said. They joined hands around the table. A young black teenager, his wary mother, and an aging white biker with a checkered past. Danielle's voice was strong and clear as she prayed. Lord, we ask for your protection in these troubled times. Help us find a way through this storm. Give us strength to stand for what's right, and wisdom to know how to do it. And Lord, thank you for bringing unlikely friends to our table. Amen. Amen, Ray echoed, his voice thick with emotion. The tension that had filled the room when he first entered had softened, like ice beginning to thaw. They weren't quite family yet, but something had shifted. In that simple prayer, they had found common ground. 3 souls caught in the same storm, trying to find their way to higher ground. The fluorescent lights of the police station's hearing room buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving. Trey sat straight-backed in his chair, his mother's hand gripping his beneath the table. Across from them, Officer Kearns and his partner sat with stony expressions, their badges gleaming under the stark lighting. The boy grabbed my arm with clear intent to assault, Kearns stated, his voice carrying across the silent room. We were conducting a routine stop when he interfered violently. Danielle's fingers tightened around Trey's hand. He could feel her trembling, though her face remained calm. The hearing officer, a gray-haired woman with tired eyes, shuffled through her papers. We have 3 witness statements that contradict this version of events. An elderly man who'd been at the gas station that day stood up from the gallery. That boy was trying to help, not hurt anybody. Those officers were roughing up that biker something fierce. Sir, please wait to be called upon, the hearing officer said, but her eyes lingered thoughtfully on Trey. More witnesses came forward, each describing how Trey had simply pulled Officer Kearns back when the situation was getting out of hand. Their words painted a picture of a brave young man trying to prevent violence, not cause it. But Kearns wouldn't back down. The camera angle doesn't show everything. He could have seriously injured me or my partner. Trey wanted to speak up, to defend himself, but his throat felt dry. His mother had taught him to be respectful to authority, but here was authority trying to twist the truth. The hearing dragged on for hours, leaving everyone drained. No immediate decision was reached, but the weight of uncertainty hung heavy over Trey and his mother as they drove home in silence. That same evening, Ray pushed open the door of the Broken Spoke, a dingy bar on the outskirts of town. The smell of stale beer and old cigarettes hit him like a wall. In the corner, he spotted who he was looking for. Mickey the Mouth Peterson, hunched over a beer, still wearing his Hell's Angels cut, despite being officially out for years. "You've been running your mouth, Mickey," Ray said, sliding onto the bar stool next to him. "Telling reporters about my old arrests, making that kid look bad." Mickey's lip curled into a sneer. "Since when do you care about some black kid from the East Side? Getting soft in your old age, bulldog?" "That kid saved my life." Ray's voice was quiet, but sharp as a blade. "While you were nowhere to be found." "We used to stand for something," Mickey spat. "Now look at you, hanging around with social justice warriors and teenagers. What happened to brotherhood?" Ray looked around the bar. Really looked. He saw the Confederate flags on the walls, the hateful symbols scrawled on the bathroom door, the angry faces of men who'd let bitterness poison their souls. These were his brothers once, but now they felt like strangers. "Brotherhood?" Ray laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is that what you call spreading lies about a 16-year-old boy, making him out to be some kind of thug?" Mickey stood up, swaying slightly. "You're the one who betrayed us, Ray. Getting all cozy with—" "With what?" Ray cut him off. "With decent people? With someone who showed more courage in 1 minute than you have in your whole miserable life." The argument grew heated. Other patrons turned to watch, sensing violence in the air. But Ray kept his fists unclenched, remembering Trey's example of choosing peace over force. "We're done here," Ray said finally, pushing away from the bar. "And I'm done with all of this." He gestured around the room. "You want to live in hate? That's your choice. But leave the kid alone." Later that night, Ray found Trey sitting on the steps of Hope Street Baptist Church. The building was dark, closed for renovations, but Trey stared at its silent doors as if willing them to open. "Can't go in?" Ray asked softly, lowering himself onto the step beside him. Trey shook his head. "Used to come here every Sunday with my dad. After he died, after the ambulance never came, I just couldn't anymore. Felt like God wasn't listening." Ray nodded, understanding loss in his bones. "You don't need faith to walk in," he said after a moment. "Just courage to try again." Something in those words reached Trey. He stood up slowly, and Ray followed. Together they approached the side door, always unlocked for those seeking sanctuary. The church was dark, except for the eternal flame near the altar, and the moon filtering through stained glass. Their footsteps echoed in the empty space as they made their way to the prayer candles. Ray's hands shook as he lit a match. "This is for Tommy," he whispered, lighting a candle. "My son. Wish you could have met him. He'd have liked you." Trey lit his own candle, tears sliding silently down his cheeks. "For my dad," he said. "He taught me to help people, to be brave." They stood there in the gentle glow, two souls bound by loss and hope, watching their candles flicker in the darkness. No words were needed. Their shared grief and determination to heal spoke volumes in the silence. "We're going to get through this," Ray said finally, his gruff voice soft in the sacred space. "Together. You help me remember who I want to be, and I'll help you stay strong. Deal?" Trey wiped his eyes and nodded. "Deal." The candles burned bright against the darkness, symbols of remembrance and renewal. In that quiet moment, their unlikely friendship deepened into something more, a covenant to help each other heal, to face their fears, and to find their way back to faith in something bigger than themselves. The seasons shifted slowly in Detroit, summer heat giving way to autumn's gentle chill. At Hope Street Outreach, change was happening too, small transformations that came with time and trust. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, Ray's old Harley would rumble up to the center's cracked parking lot. Trey would already be there, sweeping leaves or sorting donations, his backpack stuffed with homework he'd tackle between tasks. Pastor John, tall and dignified in his worn denim jacket, would greet them both with the same warm smile. "Good to see you, boys," he'd say, though Ray was old enough to be his peer. There was something about Pastor John's presence that made everyone feel young and capable of fresh starts. The center itself wasn't much, just a converted warehouse with mismatched chairs and tables, walls brightened by children's artwork. But it had become their sanctuary. Ray's arthritis would flare up during the physical work, his fingers stiffening around paintbrushes or garden tools, but he never complained. Sometimes Trey would catch him, massaging his knuckles, reaching instinctively for the cigarettes he'd given up 3 weeks ago. "You don't have to push yourself so hard," Trey told him one afternoon, as they repaired a little girl's pink bicycle. Ray just grunted, adjusting the chain with practiced care. "Neither do you, kid, but here we are." They fell into an easy rhythm. Ray knew bikes like he knew his own heartbeat, and he taught Trey everything: how to true a wheel, patch a tire, grease a stubborn gear, Each fixed bicycle meant one more child with freedom to roam, one more family helped. Danielle would stop by sometimes, bringing homemade lemonade or sandwiches. She'd watch from the doorway as Ray showed Trey how to hold a wrench properly, or as they worked side by side in the community garden. Her worried frown slowly softened into something like acceptance. "He reminds me of James," she confided to Pastor John one day, speaking of her late husband. "The way he takes time to teach, not just do." Pastor John nodded, understanding in his eyes. "God works in mysterious ways, Sister Jackson. Sometimes healing comes from the most unexpected places." The recovery meetings were held every Sunday evening in the center's main room. Folding chairs arranged in a circle, coffee brewing in the corner, stories of struggle and hope filling the air. Ray had avoided them at first, but Pastor John's gentle persistence finally won out. That particular Sunday, the room was fuller than usual. Regular faces mixed with new ones, all drawn by the same need for connection and understanding. Trey sat in the back row, trying to be invisible but unable to leave. He'd been coming for weeks now, not to share, but to listen. When Ray stood up to speak, the room grew quiet. His massive frame seemed smaller somehow, more vulnerable under the fluorescent lights. "Name's Ray," he began, his gravelly voice uncertain. "Some of you know me as Bulldog. Been sober 16 years, but that ain't the whole story." He spoke of his youth spent in anger, of prison cells and bar fights, of trying to fill an emptiness with violence and chemical courage. Then he talked about Tommy, his son, 18 years old and lost to heroin before Ray could make things right. "Found him in some fleabag motel." Ray's voice cracked, needle still in his arm. "I'd been clean 5 years by then, thought I was doing everything right. But I couldn't. I couldn't save him." In the back row, Trey wiped his eyes silently. He thought of his own father, of helplessness and loss, of prayers that seemed to go unanswered. After the meeting, they walked home together through Detroit's quiet streets. The autumn air was crisp, streetlights casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. Neither spoke for several blocks, both lost in memories. Finally, Ray broke the silence. "Maybe we both got saved that day at the gas station," he said softly. "You from fear, me from myself." Trey glanced up at him, understanding the weight of those words. "Pastor John says God doesn't waste anything, not even pain." "Smart man, your Pastor John." Ray flexed his stiff fingers, missing his cigarettes but resisting the urge. "You know, I see Tommy sometimes when I look at you, not in a sad way anymore. More like maybe I can do right by him by doing right by you." They stopped at the corner where their paths would split. Ray to his small apartment, Trey to the house where Danielle would be waiting up. "You already are," Trey said quietly. "Doing right, I mean." Ray nodded, emotion making his next words rough. "Get home safe, kid. See you Tuesday." They parted ways beneath the flickering streetlight, each carrying a little less weight than before. Behind them, Hope Street Outreach stood dark and quiet, waiting for tomorrow's work, tomorrow's healing, tomorrow's chance to begin again. The Detroit Free Press article appeared on a crisp Tuesday morning. The boy who saved a biker and the man who saved him back sprawled across the front page of the lifestyle section, accompanied by a photo of Ray and Trey working together at Hope Street, their heads bent over a bicycle they were fixing. Sarah Chen, the journalist, had spent 3 days observing them. Her article captured the small moments: Ray's patient instructions, Trey's eager learning, their shared laughter over dropped tools and tangled chains. She wrote about second chances and unlikely friendships, about healing that crossed generations and racial divides. In a city often defined by its divisions, she wrote, two souls from different worlds have found common ground in service to others. Their story reminds us that redemption isn't just personal, it ripples outward, touching entire communities. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Hope Street's donation page crashed from traffic. Local businesses sent supplies. A bike manufacturer promised 100 new bicycles for their youth program. Pastor John's phone rang constantly. "It's like Christmas," he told Trey, shaking his head in wonder. "But better. This is hope coming to life." That same morning, Trey's mother received a call from his school principal. "Given the circumstances and new information," the woman said carefully, "we've decided to lift Trey's suspension immediately. He can return to classes tomorrow." Danielle covered the phone's mouthpiece and took a deep breath. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "That would be wonderful." Later that week, as she watched Ray teaching Trey how to replace brake cables, something shifted in her heart. The man's patience, his genuine care for her son, his quiet determination to make amends. It spoke louder than any words could. That evening, she made a decision. "Trey," she called from the kitchen, "ask Ray if he'd like to join us for Sunday dinner this weekend." Trey's face lit up. "Really, Mom?" She nodded, already planning the menu. "Really, it's time." Sunday arrived with golden autumn light and nervous energy. Ray showed up at their door at exactly 5 o'clock, wearing a clean plaid shirt and carrying a homemade apple pie that made his huge hands look almost delicate. "My mama's recipe," he explained gruffly, handing it to Danielle. "Only thing I know how to bake proper." The dinner table felt small, with Ray's bulk added to it, but somehow right. Danielle had made her famous pot roast with all the fixings. The food steamed invitingly, but they paused first for grace. "Would you like to say it?" Danielle asked Ray, surprising everyone, including herself. Ray's weathered hands trembled slightly as he reached for theirs. "Lord," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "thank you for this food and this family, for second chances and new beginnings, for showing us that your love is bigger than our fears. Amen." "Amen," Trey and Danielle echoed softly. The initial awkwardness melted as they ate. Ray complimented the cooking. Danielle asked about his military service. Trey told funny stories from the bike shop. Laughter began to flow more easily, breaking down walls that had seemed insurmountable weeks ago. After the plates were cleared and the pie served, Ray excused himself briefly to get something from his truck. He returned with a small wooden box. "Been wanting to give you this," he told Trey, pushing it across the table. "Thought tonight felt right." Trey opened the box carefully. Inside lay a faded patch, red cross on white background, edges frayed with age. His eyes widened in recognition. "You were a medic?" he asked softly. Ray nodded. "Army. 2 tours in Desert Storm. Before everything went sideways in my life, I wanted to help people too." He cleared his throat. "It's yours now. Something to work toward." Trey held the patch reverently. "I'll earn this," he whispered. "I promise." Danielle watched the exchange, her eyes bright with tears. This rough man who'd frightened her so much at first was giving her son something precious. Not just a patch, but permission to dream again. Later that night, after Ray had gone home and the dishes were done, Trey carefully pinned the medic patch to his backpack. His fingers traced the worn edges, feeling the weight of its history and promise. The next morning, Ray arrived early at Hope Street. He found Pastor John in his office, going through donation papers. "Need to talk to you about something," Ray said, settling his bulk into a chair. "Been thinking about starting a veterans recovery meeting here. Place for old soldiers to heal together." Pastor John looked up, interested. "We've got space on Thursday nights. You'd lead it?" Ray nodded slowly. "Figure it's time. Can't keep taking without giving back." That's not how grace works, Pastor John reminded him gently. No, Ray agreed, a small smile touching his lips. But it sure makes the grace sweeter when you pass it on. Detroit's winter settled in like an unwelcome guest, coating Hope Street in sheets of gray ice. Inside the community center, though, warmth bloomed. Ray and Trey worked side by side, their breath visible in the early morning chill as they unloaded donated blankets and winter coats. Your hands are shaking again, Trey noticed, watching Ray struggle with a box. Just the cold, Ray muttered, but they both knew better. The old biker's health had been declining, though he refused to admit it. The local news station had set up their equipment in the main room, preparing to film a documentary about what they called the Unlikely Brotherhood. The young reporter, Sarah Chen, adjusted her microphone. "Ready when you are," she called out cheerfully. For the next 3 hours, cameras followed Ray and Trey through their daily routine. They captured moments of Ray teaching teenagers how to change bike tires, his weathered hands guiding theirs with surprising gentleness. They filmed Trey leading a study group for younger kids, his quiet confidence growing with each explanation. "It's like watching mirrors of each other," Sarah commented during a break. "The tough guy getting softer, the soft-spoken kid growing stronger." That evening, as they watched veterans file in for Ray's recovery meeting, Trey felt a deep sense of pride. Ray had built something beautiful here. The old biker stood at the front of the room, sharing stories of hope and redemption, his voice carrying weight earned through years of struggle. But peace never lasts long in a broken world. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Danielle's hands trembled as she read it, then called Trey into the kitchen. Officer Kearns was filing a civil lawsuit against her son for defamation and assault. "He claims you injured him during the gas station incident," she explained, her voice tight with anger and fear. "Says the viral video damaged his reputation." Trey sat heavily at the kitchen table, the weight of it pressing down on his shoulders. "But I didn't hurt anyone. I just pulled him away from Ray." "Sometimes truth isn't enough, baby," Danielle whispered. The next blow came less than a week later. Ray arrived at Hope Street looking more haggard than usual, his face drawn tight with worry. Police had reopened an investigation into a bar fight from his past, a cold case involving assault charges that had never stuck. "They're digging up bones," Ray told Trey quietly, between coughs that seemed to rattle his whole frame. "Looking for any reason to shut us down?" Trey began losing sleep, dark circles forming under his eyes. Every time he closed them, he saw Ray being arrested, saw his mother crying, saw everything they'd built crumbling away. The guilt ate at him like acid. If he hadn't interfered that day at the gas station, Ray would be safe. One particularly cold evening, after most volunteers had gone home, Trey found Ray behind the center. The old biker was doubled over, coughing violently. In the dim security light, Trey saw what Ray tried to hide, specks of blood on his handkerchief. "Ray!" Trey rushed forward, but Ray waved him off. "Just old sins catching up, kid," Ray wheezed, trying to smile. "Nothing to worry about." But Trey worried. He worried through classes, through volunteer shifts, through sleepless nights. He watched Ray growing paler, moving slower, stopping to catch his breath more often. Yet the old biker refused to slow down, pushing himself harder as if racing against time itself. The breaking point came on a Sunday morning. Danielle caught Trey preparing to leave for the center and blocked the door. "This has to stop," she insisted, her voice cracking. "That man is sick, Trey. The police are circling like vultures. I can't watch you get hurt again." "He needs me," Trey argued, his own voice rising. "He's family now." "He's not family," Danielle's words echoed in the small hallway. "He's a man with a past that's catching up to him, and he's going to drag you down with him." Trey stood his ground, feeling the weight of Ray's paramedic patch in his backpack. "You taught me that family isn't just blood," he said quietly. "You taught me that God puts people in our lives for a reason." "I also taught you to be wise," Danielle countered, tears gathering in her eyes. "To protect yourself." "No," Trey shook his head firmly. "You taught me to do what's right, even when it's hard. Ray stood by me when everyone else ran. I won't abandon him now." He gently moved past his mother, pausing at the door. "I love you, Mom, but I have to go." Outside, the winter wind cut through his jacket like knives, but Trey barely felt it. His mind was too full of worry. For Ray's health, for the lawsuit, for his mother's fear. Yet underneath it all ran a current of certainty. Whatever came next, they would face it together. At Hope Street, he found Ray already there, arranging chairs for the morning service. The old biker's hands shook as he worked, but his eyes were clear and determined. When he saw Trey, something like pride flickered across his weathered face. "Thought your mama might keep you home today," Ray said softly. "She tried," Trey admitted, grabbing the other end of a folding table. "But I learned something about family this year. Sometimes it chooses you." Ray nodded, understanding all that wasn't said. They worked in comfortable silence, preparing the space for another day of healing and hope, while outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The division in the community started slowly, like a crack spreading across ice. At first, it was just whispers and sideways glances. Then came the signs in windows, some supporting Trey, others condemning him. The Hope Street neighborhood, once united in purpose, began to fracture. "Look what they wrote!" Trey's voice shook as he stared at the brick wall of Hope Street Outreach one morning. Angry red letters spelled out "Traitor's Den" across the faded white paint. Below it, someone had drawn a crude noose. Ray placed a weathered hand on Trey's shoulder. "We'll paint over it," he said firmly. "Just like we'll get through everything else." But the graffiti was just the beginning. The monthly donations that kept Hope Street's lights on dwindled to almost nothing. Regular volunteers stopped showing up. Even Pastor John's old military buddies, who'd been steady supporters, stayed away. "They're scared," Pastor John explained one evening, his usual warm smile strained. "The police union's got people believing Trey's some kind of militant troublemaker, and Ray—" He trailed off, glancing at the old biker. "Well, folks remember who you used to be." Ray nodded grimly, his jaw tight. "Can't blame them. My past ain't pretty." The subpoena arrived on a Tuesday, stark white paper demanding Ray's testimony in the case against Trey. Officer Kearns's lawsuit had gained momentum, backed by a police union eager to make an example of the situation. The morning of the hearing dawned cold and gray. Outside the courthouse, two crowds gathered, supporters holding "Stand with Trey" signs on one side, angry protesters with "Back the Blue" banners on the other. The tension crackled like electricity before a storm. Trey walked up the courthouse steps between his mother and Ray, trying to look brave despite his trembling hands. Someone from the protest line shouted a racial slur. Ray's shoulders stiffened, but he kept walking. Inside the courtroom, Ray took the stand. His leather jacket was replaced by a borrowed suit that seemed to hang wrong on his frame. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, every scar and line on his face stood out like a map of hard years. "Mr. Myers," the prosecutor began, "please tell the court about your criminal record." Ray's voice, usually gruff, came out clear and steady. "I've done time for assault, drug possession, armed robbery, been in more fights than I can count, spent most of my life being exactly what everyone thought I was, a violent man, a criminal." The prosecutor smiled slightly. "So you admit you have a history of—" "I ain't finished," Ray cut in. "See, that's who I was. But that day at the gas station, something different happened. That boy," he pointed to Trey, He didn't see my record or my patches or my skin color. He saw a human being getting hurt, and he stepped in. Not with violence, with courage. Ray's voice cracked, slightly. I've known violence my whole life. What Trey did wasn't violent. He pulled that officer back, gentle as handling a child. He used his voice, not his fists. That boy defended a man, not a monster. And maybe... Ray paused, wiping his eyes roughly. Maybe that's what finally made me see I didn't have to be a monster anymore either. The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge seemed moved. But then the questioning turned brutal. Every detail of Ray's past exposed like wounds torn fresh. Each admission felt like another nail in his coffin, another reason for the system to lock him away again. As Ray stepped down from the stand, his face had gone gray. He made it 3 steps into the hallway before stumbling, one hand clutching his chest. "Ray!" Trey broke away from his mother, rushing forward as the old biker collapsed against the wall. "Somebody help! We need a medic!" Ray's eyes were unfocused, his breathing shallow. "Sorry, kid," he gasped. "Thought I was stronger than this." Trey held Ray's hand, tears streaming down his face as courthouse security called for emergency services. "Stay with me," he begged. "Please, Ray, stay with me." The sirens grew louder. That familiar wail Trey had always dreamed of following as a paramedic. But now, kneeling beside the man who'd become like a father to him, those sirens carried a different weight. "Ray!" Trey's voice echoed down the marble hallway as medics rushed in with a stretcher. "Ray, I'm right here!" But Ray's eyes had closed, his hand going limp in Trey's grip as the medics worked. The sound of sirens filled the air, drowning out Trey's prayers, carrying away the one person who'd taught him true courage. The steady beep of heart monitors filled the sterile hospital room. Ray's eyes fluttered open, squinting against the harsh fluorescent lights. His chest felt like it was wrapped in iron bands, each breath a struggle. Through the fog of medication, he made out the shape of a police officer stationed outside his door. A doctor in a white coat checked his vitals, explaining in careful terms about heart failure, years of hard living finally catching up. But Ray barely heard the medical details. His mind was on Trey, wondering if the boy was okay after everything that happened at the courthouse. 3 days later, they transferred Ray to a state medical facility. His pending charges from the reopened case meant he needed security, even in his weakened state. The facility was a strange mix of hospital and prison, bars on windows, guards in corridors, but nurses making rounds with medication carts. That first weekend, Trey came to visit. The teenager had to go through multiple security checks, emptying his pockets and submitting to a pat-down. Guards whispered as he passed, some recognizing him from the news. Trey held his head high, just like Ray had taught him. The visiting room was sparse, just a few plastic chairs and a small table bolted to the floor. When they wheeled Ray in, Trey's heart clenched. The old biker looked smaller somehow, his weathered face pale against the white hospital gown. But his blue eyes still held that familiar spark. "You look like you've seen a ghost, kid," Ray tried to joke, his voice raspy. Trey managed a smile, pulling his chair closer. "How are you feeling?" "Like I went 10 rounds with a semi-truck." Ray adjusted himself in the wheelchair, wincing. "But I've had worse." They talked about Hope Street, about Pastor John keeping things running. Trey mentioned helping younger kids with homework after school, trying to keep the center's spirit alive despite everything. Ray nodded approvingly, though pain flickered across his face. Near the end of the visit, Ray grew serious. "You remind me of my son, Trey," he said quietly. "Same heart, same way of seeing good in broken things." His hands trembled slightly. "I failed him, couldn't keep him from the life that killed him. But you..." Ray's voice cracked. Don't you fail yourself. You're stronger than that. Trey reached for Ray's hand, squeezing gently. I won't fail either of us, he promised. The days stretched into weeks. Trey threw himself into volunteering, channeling Ray's lessons about redemption and service. He tutored kids at Hope Street, helped Pastor John organize food drives, and stood strong beside his mother through continuing legal challenges. Each weekend, Trey made the journey to visit Ray. Sometimes they talked about serious things, faith, forgiveness, the future. Other times they just sat together, watching sunlight pattern the floor through barred windows. On one visit, Trey noticed Ray seemed different, frailer physically, but somehow more at peace. The old biker's hands shook as he reached for his water cup. Been thinking a lot, Ray said, his voice soft. About that day at the gas station, about choices. Trey leaned forward, listening. World's full of people telling you who deserves saving and who doesn't. Ray's eyes were clear despite his weakness. Don't let them decide for you, Trey. Don't let anyone tell you who to save. Sunlight streamed through the window, warming their clasped hands. Ray's breathing had grown more labored, but his face was serene. Think I need to rest a bit, he murmured, eyes growing heavy. Trey held on as Ray drifted to sleep, the afternoon light painting shadows across their joined hands, one young and strong, one weathered by time, connected by something stronger than circumstance or fear. The only sounds were Ray's steady breathing and the distant footsteps of guards. In that quiet moment, surrounded by institutional walls but touched by natural light, Trey understood something profound about grace, how it could bridge any divide, heal any heart, save any soul willing to receive it. The call came at 6:15 in the morning, 2 days after Trey's last visit. The warden's voice was solemn over the phone as he informed Pastor John about Ray's passing. The old biker had died peacefully, in his sleep, his heart finally giving out after years of strain. Pastor John made the difficult drive to Trey's house, arriving just as dawn broke over Detroit. When Danielle opened the door and saw his face, she knew. She called Trey down from his room, and together they sat at the kitchen table as Pastor John delivered the news. Trey didn't cry at first. He just sat there, very still, his hands folded in his lap like they were made of glass. Can I see him?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The warden said we can collect his belongings," Pastor John explained gently. "He wanted you to have them, Trey. He made that clear before—" The drive to the state facility was quiet. Trey stared out the window, watching the city wake up, people heading to work, kids waiting for school buses, life continuing as if nothing had changed. But for Trey, everything felt different, like the world had shifted on its axis. At the facility, a guard led them to a small room where Ray's few possessions were laid out on a metal table. There wasn't much, just a well-worn Bible with dog-eared pages and notes in the margins, a faded photograph of a young man who must have been Ray's son, and his Hell's Angels vest, the leather cracked and softened by years of wear. Trey picked up the Bible first, running his fingers over the cover where Ray's rough hands had touched countless times. The photograph showed a younger version of Ray standing next to a teenage boy with the same blue eyes, both smiling at the camera. On the back was written, "Tommy, age 16, 1998. When Trey lifted the vest, something fell from one of the pockets, a folded piece of paper with his name written on the outside in Ray's shaky handwriting. His hands trembled as he opened it. "You gave me my last ride, kid," the letter read. "Keep the road open for someone else." The words blurred as tears finally came. Pastor John wrapped his arms around Trey as the boy's shoulders shook with sobs. They stood there for a long time, grief and gratitude mixing together in the sterile room. The next morning, Trey sat at his kitchen table, Ray's letter in his hands. Danielle made coffee, the familiar scent filling their small kitchen as morning light filtered through the windows. His voice wavered as he began reading the letter aloud to his mother. "Dear Trey," he read, "by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Don't waste time being sad. I've lived more life in these past months with you than I did in all the years before. You showed me that redemption isn't just a word in Pastor John's sermons. It's real, and it's possible for anyone brave enough to reach for it." Danielle wiped tears from her cheeks as Trey continued reading. When he finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. "That man became family," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "He really did." They began planning a memorial service at Hope Street. Pastor John offered to handle the arrangements, but Trey wanted to help. They weren't sure how many people would come. Ray had burned a lot of bridges in his old life, and the recent controversies had divided the community. But as word spread about Ray's passing, something remarkable happened. People started calling, not just the regulars from Hope Street, but bikers from Ray's old crew, veterans who'd attended his recovery meetings, even some of the police officers who'd gotten to know him over the past months. On the morning of the service, Trey stood with Pastor John on the steps of Hope Street, watching in amazement as people began arriving. First came the bikers, their motorcycles rumbling down the street in a long procession. They parked in neat rows, leather-clad men and women removing their helmets with solemn respect. Then came the police cars, officers in dress uniforms stepping out to shake hands with the bikers. Veterans in military jackets stood shoulder to shoulder with neighborhood mothers. Children from the center's after-school programs handed out programs decorated with hand-drawn motorcycles. The small community center couldn't hold everyone. People spilled out onto the sidewalk, standing quietly as Pastor John began the service. He spoke about redemption and second chances, about a man who found his way back to grace through an unexpected friendship. Trey sat in the front row between his mother and Pastor John, Ray's vest folded carefully in his lap. As he looked out at the gathered crowd, hundreds of faces, once divided by fear and mistrust, now united in memory of one man's journey to redemption, he understood what Ray's final message truly meant. The road Ray spoke of wasn't just a physical path, but the journey from darkness to light, from division to unity, from fear to love. And keeping it open meant continuing the work they'd started together, building bridges, healing wounds, showing that grace could transform even the hardest hearts. As Amazing Grace filled the air, sung by voices that had never joined together before, Trey held his mother's hand and felt Ray's presence in every note, in every tear, in every moment of unexpected unity that filled that sacred space. When it came time for Trey to speak, he walked slowly to the front of the room. The weight of hundreds of eyes followed his every step. His hands shook as he unfolded a piece of paper, then thought better of it and tucked it back into his pocket. Ray had always spoken from the heart. Taking a deep breath, Trey looked out at the gathered faces, bikers with weathered cheeks wet with tears, veterans standing straight-backed against the walls, neighbors and friends filling every available space. In the very back, partially hidden in shadow, sat Officer Kearns in his dress uniform, his expression unreadable. "I met Ray Myers at a gas station," Trey began, his voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. "Most people would say that's where I saved his life, but the truth is, that's where he started saving mine." Danielle watched from the front row, her heart swelling with pride as her son stood tall before the crowd. His voice carried clear and strong, just like his father's used to when he preached. "Ray taught me that saving a life doesn't always mean using your hands. Sometimes it means opening your heart." Trey paused, swallowing hard. "He showed me that redemption isn't about being perfect. It's about getting up every time you fall and trying to do better." In the back of the room, Officer Kearns lowered his head, his shoulders tense. The words seemed to hang heavy in the air around him. "Ray used to tell me stories about riding under the stars," Trey continued, his voice thick with emotion. "He said that's where he felt closest to God, closest to who he was meant to be. But I think he found his true purpose right here at Hope Street, helping others find their way back to the light." Pastor John nodded encouragingly from his seat, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm patterns across the gathered faces. Someone once asked Ray why he spent so much time working with troubled kids and veterans. He said, "Because somebody needs to show them there's more road ahead." That's what he did for me. He showed me that the path forward isn't about forgetting the past. It's about learning from it, growing from it, using it to help others. Several of the bikers nodded, their leather creaking as they shifted in their seats. A few veterans straightened their jackets, eyes glistening with unshed tears. Ray wasn't perfect. He'd be the first to tell you that. But he was real. He was honest about his struggles, his mistakes, his hopes. And in being real, he showed us all what true strength looks like. Danielle reached for Pastor John's hand, squeezing it tight as she watched her son speak with a wisdom beyond his 16 years. As Trey finished speaking, a profound silence filled the room. Then, slowly, people began to stand. The applause started soft, but grew until it filled every corner of Hope Street, a thunderous appreciation for both the man they'd lost and the young man standing before them. After the service, as people mingled over coffee and shared memories, a well-dressed man approached Trey and Danielle. He introduced himself as Marcus Thompson, a local philanthropist who'd been following their story. "What you and Ray built here, it's something special," Thompson said, looking around at the diverse crowd still talking and embracing. "I'd like to help make sure it continues. I want to fund the Ray Myers Foundation, focused on helping at-risk youth and veterans." Trey's eyes widened as Thompson explained his vision. Programs for teens, support for veterans, all building on the work Ray had started. When Thompson offered Trey the position of youth coordinator, Danielle started to protest about his age, but Thompson held up his hand. "Your son has shown wisdom and courage beyond his years," he said. "Who better to reach other young people than someone who's walked their path?" As the crowd began to disperse, Trey carefully folded Ray's vest and slung it over his shoulder. He said goodbye to Pastor John, hugged his mother, and decided to walk home alone. The early evening air was cool and clear, with stars just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. He stopped at the corner where he used to meet Ray for their morning walks to Hope Street. Looking up at the stars twinkling overhead, he remembered Ray's words. "These are the same stars I've ridden under all my life, kid. They remind me that no matter how dark things get, there's always light to guide you home." The vest felt heavy on his shoulder, heavy with memories, with responsibility, with promise. But it was a weight Trey was ready to carry, just as Ray had carried him through his darkest days. The stars continued to emerge, one by one, like beacons lighting the road ahead. Spring arrived in Detroit like a gentle awakening. The harsh winter gave way to tender green buds and warming breezes that carried the scent of new beginnings. At Hope Street, the garden Trey and Ray had planted months ago burst with fresh life, tulips and daffodils dotting the earth like scattered sunshine. 3 months into his emergency medical technician training, Trey balanced studying with his continued work at the center. The Ray Myers Foundation had transformed the old building's basement into a small medical outreach station, complete with a donated ambulance that served the neighborhood. Every shift reminded Trey of his original dream, to make sure no one died waiting for help that never came. On this particular morning, Trey checked supplies in the ambulance while humming the same gospel tune he'd sung that fateful day at the gas station. His uniform, crisp and white, felt like a promise fulfilled. Ray's old paramedic patch, now properly earned, sat proudly on his shoulder. "Dispatch to Hope Street Outreach," the radio crackled. "Motorcycle accident at Jefferson and 3rd. Single rider down." Trey's heart quickened as he jumped into the passenger seat. Their driver, Marcus, a veteran who'd known Ray, hit the sirens. The familiar wail that once haunted Trey's dreams now felt like a call to purpose. They found the crash scene quickly. A Harley-Davidson laid on its side, its rider sprawled nearby. The man's leather jacket was scuffed raw, his helmet cracked but intact. As Trey knelt beside him, the morning sun caught something familiar, a faded Hell's Angels patch on the rider's sleeve. "Sir, can you hear me?" Trey asked, checking vitals with steady hands. "I'm Trey with Hope Street Medical. We're here to help." The man's eyes fluttered open, clouded with pain. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead. "Bulldog," he whispered, recognition flickering across his face. "You're that kid, Bulldog's kid." Trey's throat tightened, but his training kept him focused. "That's right. Ray was my friend, and now I'm here for you, just like he would be." The man's weathered hand found Trey's wrist, squeezing weakly. "I was a friend of Bulldog's, back in the day." Trey secured the man's neck in a brace while speaking softly. "Then he's still watching over you, through me." Together with Marcus, they stabilized the rider and loaded him carefully into the ambulance. The man's vitals were strong. He'd been lucky. As Marcus prepared to transport, Trey stepped out for a moment, needing air. The spring morning had bloomed fully now. Sunlight danced through new leaves, and somewhere nearby, church bells began their Sunday song. Trey closed his eyes, feeling the warmth on his face. The sound of the bells carried him back to that night in the empty church with Ray, when they'd lit candles for their lost fathers and found something like family in each other. "We both got saved that day," Trey whispered to the sky, knowing Ray would understand. That gas station moment hadn't just been about one life saved. It had been about two souls finding redemption through each other. Walking back to the ambulance, Trey passed the wall of Hope Street, where local artists had painted a mural months ago. It showed two figures, one young and black, one older and white, standing together against a backdrop of stars and motorcycle wheels. Below it, words in flowing script read, "Hope rides with courage." The images captured their story perfectly. Trey in his EMT uniform, Ray in his leather vest, both transformed by grace and unexpected brotherhood. The mural had become a neighborhood landmark, a reminder that love could bridge any divide. As Trey climbed back into the ambulance, he glanced once more at the wall. Ray's painted eyes seemed to twinkle with that same mischievous light they'd had in life. Some angels ride in leather, Trey thought with a smile, and some on two wheels of faith. Marcus put the ambulance in gear, and they headed toward the hospital. The spring morning continued to unfold around them, full of promise and possibility. Through the open window, Trey felt the breeze against his face, the same wind that Ray used to say carried prayers straight to heaven. The church bells faded slowly behind them, their echo lingering like a blessing over the awakening city. In the back of the ambulance, Ray's friend dozed peacefully, watched over by the legacy of a man who'd learned it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.